Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/heroes, villains, and sidekicks. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hi, this week on the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show, I'll be walking us through the origin and backstory of my favorite Martian, John Jones. Then, we get to hear about John from one of the greatest comic book writers out there, J.M. DeMatteis, who wrote the incredible 1988 miniseries that deepened John's origins, making him one of the most interesting characters in the DCU. And that's what we'll be doing here on the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show. We'll be learning and talking about the origins and backstories of heroes, villains, and sidekicks throughout the comic book universe and pop culture. We'll look at both popular and obscure characters you may have never heard of, but I think you'll really dig. John Jones, the Martian Manhunter, was created by writer Joseph Shamuson and designed by artist Joe Certa, and first appeared in Detective Comics 225 way back in 1955 as actually a secondary story that ran only 6 pages, which was titled Introducing John Jones, Manhunter from Mars. John's been around a long time and was actually part of the original 7 members of the Justice League that appeared first in The Brave and the Bold, number 28, back in 1960. He's one of those characters that throughout the years has been a part of just about every type of media also, not just comics. You can find John in Lego games, all the animated Justice League cartoons, and television shows, the latest being the hit CW show Supergirl. So let's take a look at the origin of one of my favorite characters. John Jones, the Martian Manhunter, as you may have guessed it, is from Mars, and when he wants to be, is humanoid with green skin. That's a pretty simple, basic description of him. I can only assume that they made him green because of the whole Little Green Men from Mars idea that made its way into popular science fiction. But as I say, he's humanoid when he wants to be. One of John's many powers is his ability to change his shape and look, transforming himself into whoever he pleases. We'll get into more of his amazing power set later on. Believe me, it is extensive and varied. So how does John get from Mars to the third rock from the sun? Well, a genius scientist named Saul Erdel exclaims that he has succeeded in building the robot brain of the century, which I love, the robot brain. You can tell this is in the 50s, right? With it, he plans on using it to probe other dimensions and space. He then pushes a button saying that he wonders what his robot brain will encounter as it begins its exploration. Doctor wonders if it will travel and search out just space or perhaps even the 4th dimension. It is then that after a lot of buzzing and clicking, Dr. Erdel stands face to face with an imposing green man in a cape, standing in a classic superhero pose. John asks where he is and is told that he is on Earth, and John explains that he is from the 4th planet from the sun, Mars. The doctor is amazed and excited that his robot brain worked so well. But the doctor is suddenly crestfallen when he has to tell John that he cannot immediately send him back to Mars, that it would take weeks, months, or even years to change the thinking plot of the brain. Now, I'm not sure what that means, but John, he's not going home anytime soon. John tells the doctor that he realizes that he meant no harm and he must stay, but he has to change his appearance to fit in. It's then that John changes into the form of a regular Earthman. Now, the doctor is amazed at this point that he could just change shape and look just like a regular human being. But this is all way too much for his ailing heart. And the doctor actually dies, and while he's dying, he is apologizing to John for not being able to return him home. Now, John, at this point, he looks out the window and he's talking to himself, and he says that his people are millions of miles away, but that they are working on a project called Star Drive that is a rocket that can come for him. But he doesn't know how long it will take. It could be years, maybe centuries. So he dons a trench coat and fedora and heads out the door. He then makes a quick stop at the beach and says he is able to extract gold particles from the Earth's seas, which makes sense. If you are new to Earth, you are going to need a little bit of cash. So that's how he does this. This is how John actually bankrolls his new life on Earth. He sort of before he sort of gets a job as a detective in the police force, he gets some gold from the sea, which I didn't know was possible. But what do I know about these types of scientific things? Maybe you can extract gold from the sea. I don't know. Maybe he isn't getting it from the water. Maybe he's just getting it. Maybe there's mixes in with the sand or something. I don't know. This is what he says. It was 1955, and he is extracting gold from particles in Earth's seas. John then travels the world a bit and decides he wants to help out when he realizes how much crime there is on Earth. It's then that he decides to become a detective, Detective John Jones. The John appears again in Detective Comics 236, living on Earth as a human solving crimes. And there's something I didn't realize that in these comics, because I'm more familiar with sort of the modern retelling of John's origins. But when he was on Earth back in, when these Detective 236 happened, he was actually in contact with Mars. He was in contact with his people while he was living on Earth. Now, why this is surprising to me was that, like I said, I am more familiar with the updated sort of retconned origin from the 4-issue miniseries Martian Manhunter that came out in 1988, written by J.M. DeMatteis. Now, more on that in a minute, because again, we're going to be talking to J.M. later on in the show. Now, John then continues his life of civil service, being a detective and helping out the people of Earth, and at the same time continues his adventures as a caped hero, teaming up with Batman and actually notably Green Arrow at some point. Now, on one mission, while in his human form, the detective, his human, detective persona, John Jones, is actually killed. And it's then that Martian Manhunter decides to abandon his human persona and takes up being a superhero full-time. He then becomes a member of the Justice League and can also be found actually in the pages of House of Mystery. So when he moved out of being just sort of backup stories in, a character in Detective Comics, he didn't get his own series right away, but he ended up in the pages of House of Mystery. And this is, unfortunately, just his character being underutilized. I think it would have been great to just bust out with his own title at that point. But then again, I'm biased, right? He's one of my favorite characters. But at the same time, it could not have been easy for the writers. I mean, here's this character that is, pretty much more powerful than Superman, is from another world, and, he's kind of, a fish out of water. He's like Superman in his backstory and his power. So how do you use this character? And a lot of times he ends up being sort of like a stand-in for Superman and is just not really fully developed. Now again, John continues his life on Earth as a Martian Manhunter, working with the Justice League, but this all changes in issue 71 of the Justice League of America. Again, something I had no idea of. At this point in issue 71, John's people, his fellow Martians, finally finish building their Star Ride, which is a great name, and they come to Earth to bring John home. And they actually do it. John gets on the ship and leaves and says goodbye. And I've got some great pages from that issue over on heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com. If you head over there to the episodes page and you look for the post, the John Jones Martian Manhunter, I've got tons of images from some of these original stories that are just amazing. Because again, I didn't know this. I didn't know he was in contact. That he then went home. It was all pretty interesting. Now, as you may have guessed it, John does come back to Earth, and he bounces around and, is not really brought back into the fold sort of a mainstream DC Comics until the sort of tail end of Justice League of America, the team that had sort of Vixen and Vibe and him, and he was brought back with the just hugely successful and now just extremely popular. I think it just celebrated its 30-year history. The Justice League that Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis wrote and plotted with art, just amazing art by Kevin Maguire. And, this is the team that had, Booster Gold and Blue Beetle, of course, the blue and the gold. It had Guy Gardner, of course, John Johns, just so many interesting characters. Batman, just it was the, it was just great stories, funny stories, and it's sometimes referred to as like the Baja era of the JLA because it was pretty funny. You had all these characters, that were very different, and they just the comedy creeped into it, and to see sort of like Batman and Guy Gardner and Captain Marvel just sort of talking in their different personalities, it was such a fun comic, and I remember just loving that book. Now, they started giving John at this point a little bit more of a background too. They started adding some funny personality quirks, like the fact that he loved like an Oreo type cookie, that he loved Oreos. John, he doesn't technically, I guess, need to eat, but he did love those Oreos. And there's some really funny shots of him. I think I put on the episodes page where he's sort of, sitting on like a huge like tower of Oreos, just mowing down on them. And then in 1988, J.M. DeMatteis wrote a 4-issue miniseries that completely rewrote John's backstory, really fleshing him out and changing his entire origin and everything really about the character. So like I mentioned, I didn't even know that John had contact and even went back to Mars. I was more familiar with the miniseries by J.M. This was a retcon that really gave the character much more depth. I can't recall many origin retcons that upend a character's entire life story, but also keep the core of the character true. Now, this new origin is much darker than Silver Age version. Much darker and, at some points very depressing and very, very hard to see what they're doing to this character. And in the miniseries, John begins to have hallucinations of, this is one of those comic book words that's hard for me to pronounce, Horimer, and who's considered, on some of Mars either being the god of death and fire. Others consider him the god of light and life on Mars. I guess really it all depends on which way you're looking at him. But this is actually no hallucination. This god of Mars is actually reaching out to John, since he is the last son of Mars, trying to shake him from the illusion that he has been living all of this time. And it's this illusion that he is beginning to shake when we start to see the truth that is just horrible. Now, in the original origin, like we mentioned, John was brought to Earth from Mars and was greeted by Dr. Ertl, and he, Dr. Ertl just died, and he couldn't take it. His heart gave out. John then took the guise of John Jones, a detective and superhero. So it's all very, Silver Age, very up and, peppy and happy. Now, other than the fact that he died, the scientist. Now, here's the thing. In this new telling, penned by J.M. DeMatteis, John, DeMatteis doesn't just jettison John's Silver Age origin, which is totally interesting. He upends it and deepens the character's history and psyche. Now, Horimer begins to open up John's mind and allowing him to finally start to see what actually happened to him in his homeworld. So this is the coolest thing. John believes now he is hallucinating, but Horimer is real and is drawn to John again since he's the last of his kind. Now, he is on Earth to open John's mind to facts behind his transportation to Earth by the good doctor's communication device. Now, John fights these visions, and all the while he's doing this, it's really fascinating because, he's a shapeshifter, so his body's going through these extreme changes, twisting and warping. John is also seeing himself on Mars, the Mars he always believed to be true. It was like noble alien warriors and poets and cities of wonder, and they all looked like him, this sort of beetle-browed green man. And then the visions morph, over time into just a real horror show. The figures of there are figures of Martians, but they don't resemble John. They're very stretched, very angular, very alien. And at this point, he even begins to start to see that he had a wife and child. Now we start to get to be seeing the part that he really repressed, because he begins to see that their planet, that Mars, was being ravaged by a hideous plague that is killing, the entire population. John sees his wife, and he sees her dead, and he sees her body thrown on these funeral pyres along with thousands of other dead people of Mars, and because they have to destroy the bodies. He also then sees he had a daughter, and she is consumed by the plague, and she is dead in his arms. And he's seeing all these things, and in seeing them, it just drives him insane. And John just flies, off half blind, just through on Earth, just flies off half blind, and actually crashes and ends up at a country house where there's actually someone there to meet him. And it's Dr. Erdel. It turns out he's very much alive and has been waiting for John because he's sort of got a little psychic bond with him. He knew he was coming. So Erdel and John sit and talk. John is confused and tormented, and it's then he learns the bitter truth. When John was brought to Earth, Erdel tells him, through the transporter, he was actually holding his dead daughter. So the first thing that Erdel sees isn't this noble sort of stereotypical, Martian from another planet. He sees this totally alien-looking being holding the body of his child, and how Mark Badger draws it. It looks painful and horrific. Now, at this point, when he's brought here, by Erdel in this new retelling, John just loses his mind because he just cannot take everything that has happened to him, and he falls into a catatonic state. Now, while in this state, he and Erdel form a very personal and strong psychic bond. And while in this state, Erdel tries to help John by, for good or for bad, filling his mind with the ideal Martian life. There's no plague, he didn't lose his family, there was no family, there was no horrors, there was no flames, there were no people just, burning body upon body. And John, at this point from Dr. Erdel, also realizes not only that his life is a lie because, really to help him function, John also learns that his form that he has had all these years that we're used to seeing is really just a construct of what Erdel believed an alien from Mars might look like based on old 1950 conceptions. So not only does he realize his life has been a lie, he realizes that his form is a lie, that he even starts speaking in a language he doesn't even understand. He realizes that there's a Martian language that he knows that he can begin to speak again. So this is just, this is what I mean by you don't just jettison this Silver Age story. You look at this story and you say, what can I do with this? And how do I update it in a way that really adds, and I keep saying depth, but that's what it gives this character. Nothing is more tragic and third rail than the death of a child. And here's this hero, this man who has given so much to the earth, and all he does is help. Even his alter ego is help. And you learn of just what he's lost. And it was just, I remember reading it, and I actually reread it before I wrote this and before I talked to JM, and it holds up. It is just a fantastic read if you get a chance to pick that up. It's just Martian Manhunter is the title. So John then asks Dr. Erdel to send him back to Mars via his machine, which he does. Now there Hormer reveals the truth of the plague and how John, to find peace, must let his family rest. John thinks of Hormer as the god of death and fire, but he explains to him, no, I'm the god of life. And, you're seeing things through a twisted sense of your own mind and what you were led to believe and what you needed to believe to survive. So it's really this really interesting, exploration and psychological exploration of this character, and it's really fascinating. And this is an 88, and it was a really good and deep read, and like I said, it holds up very well. Now, Hormer says, what he needs to do and why he's being so tormented at this point and why all this stuff is surfacing is he needs to let go, and he needs to let go of his family, and he needs to let go of the past so that they can rest in peace. Now, you would think it'd be over with, that he'd already been tortured enough, but at this point, John is obviously realizing he's there on Mars, and it doesn't look like the Mars he's remembering in his head even now. There's no cities, there's no, people, Martians. And that's when Hormer drops the last bomb on him, the final shoe drops, in that the reason there is no longer life on Mars is because John was not only transported, from Mars from like a distance, but he was also transported through time, several centuries. So he is totally out of time. There is no Mars left. His family is gone. And it's then that John makes peace with his past, the loss of his family. He says goodbye, and these feelings of torment and horror they leave him, and he returns to Earth, and he's actually in his true form. And it isn't this, 1950s, representation of an alien. He's this really elongated figure, and he can speak Martian, and it's just such a cool way to update this character. And I really love this miniseries, and if you love the character, I would definitely, hit eBay and check that out. You might even be able to get the trade over on Amazon, but you should really definitely check that out. And one aspect revealed from the new origin concerned John's only weakness. Now, every hero has one, and John's was fire. But DeMatteis turns this basic weakness, one that was due to, how fire affected his body, like say it was, his body reacted poorly to fire, as humans do. The way that DeMatteis worked it was that this was a psychological weakness that manifested itself in sort of like a physical pain. So the one thing that, didn't get wiped, what they're saying, what he's saying is the one thing that didn't get wiped away from John's mind was the subconscious memory of his people and his family's dead bodies being burned after dying from the plague. So again, this weakness is now turned into a purely psychological weakness that John can sort of work through and at some point, not be affected by fire. I mean, it's just really great stuff. And now a quick word from our sponsor. For you, the listeners of the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks Show, Audible has offered a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. Now, I love Audible. You're driving in the car. I got a decent commute, so I listen to books all the time. And, check out some of these books. These are some books I really enjoyed listening to. Some amazing comic book-based books. One is Marvel Comics, The Untold Story. Just if you are interested in, even if you're a DC fan, amazing just behind the scenes of Marvel Comics through the years. So Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, the Supergirls, Fashion, Feminism, Fantasy, and the History of Comic Book Heroines. Will Eisner, A Dreamer's Life in Comics, that was fantastic. And one of my favorites that I've listened to lately, Super Gods, What Masked Vigilantes, Miraculous Mutants, and the Sun God from Smallville Can Teach Us About Being Human. And Grant Morrison wrote that one. I'm a huge Grant Morrison fan. So to download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/heroes, villains, and sidekicks. And again, that's audibletrial.com/heroes, villains, and sidekicks for your free audiobook. And even though John has been around for so long and he's been, teamed up with so many different characters, and he was a huge part of this really popular Justice League run and title, the character can never seem to helm a comic title of his own that doesn't get canceled really shortly after it starts. But he is actually, the funny thing is, since this is true, he keeps these comics of his keeps getting canceled. He's actually on one of the hottest superhero TV shows right now. He's on Supergirl. And I have to say, how they represent John on screen, just how he looks, the makeup, the costume, how he shifts, it is probably, I have to say, one of the best looking characters, and a character that looks so true to the comic that I have ever seen, probably in TVs or movies. It is just incredible how he looks. Now, something we haven't talked about yet, we've talked about how cool John is and what his powers are and weaknesses are, but we haven't talked about John's powers. Well, he has a pretty impressive and diverse power set, a power set that I think makes him the most powerful character in the DCU. Let's take a look at what John can do. So basically, due to his Martian physiology, John is able to change his mass, color, relative shape, even imitating clothing if desired, which actually makes me wonder if John is really just kind of walking around naked. If the clothes are a part of him, he's really technically not wearing anything. So that's strange. I hadn't thought of that before. Okay, so let's start off with one of his, big powers, shape-shifting. One of the most incredible powers possessed by the Martian Manhunter is his ability to shapeshift. He is able to change his entire body into any form, impersonating people and supers. He can form any type of clothing and even form basic sort of machine kind of weapons. Like he couldn't make himself a gun, but he could make a sword arm or something like that from his own body. He can even shift into something as large as a building or as small as a fly. And I think because of his innate abilities as a detective and someone who watches people and humanity, that when he takes the shape of someone, he can really accurately mimic them. I mean, that's my own opinion, but I think that ability of being a detective and watching people would also help you then be able to mimic people once you become them. Invisibility. John is able to change his skin so that it loses the ability to reflect light, hence rendering himself invisible. And if he concentrates, he can even sort of change his skin enough and render himself completely invisible to all spectrums of light, such as infrared and ultraviolet light. He's not intangible. If you walked into him, you would definitely bump up against something. But of course, you'd need to find him first. Phasing. John is able to phase through any object by altering his body's mass and density. This makes sense since he obviously has control pretty much over every aspect of his body's cellular structure. I mean, if he can turn it into anything, he can move it just enough so it can sort of weave in and out of, the molecules of a solid structure, sort of like the Flash does. Superhuman durability. John is pretty much able to withstand any type of bullets and or objects that mean him harm. He is nearly invulnerable. And add that to his ability to shift into any form, I mean, that pretty much makes him pretty unstoppable. Strength. John is on par with Superman as far as strength goes, fighting him to a stalemate in some stories and even drawing blood from Superman himself. Regeneration. He can regenerate from the most horrible injuries, almost any injury. And actually in one storyline, he even regenerated from just a severed hand of his own. Flight and superhuman speed. It goes without saying that John is able to fly at amazing speeds for great distances, even being able to keep up with Superman himself. He also has the ability to move at incredible speeds, being able to fly around the world in seconds and snatch bullets from midair. Telepathy. To me, this is the power that makes him the most powerful being in the DCU. Now, in addition to all those other powers, he is the most powerful telepath on the planet. He is able to read any mind with no difficulties and even over great distances. For example, he has been seen using his telepathy to communicate with someone from the Earth to the Moon. And he is not only able to read minds, but control them over great distances as well. He can make a person believe what he wants and even forget what has happened to them. His mind is even powerful enough to act as a telepathic relay. So what I mean by that is, while a member of the JLA, he was actually the team's communication hub. So through him, all other team members' minds were linked, and they could communicate with each other over great distances. John is also able to use his mind to move objects through telekinesis, no matter the weight, as long as he concentrates. Intellect. John has a genius-level intellect and is an astute judge of characters and human nature. Now, his intelligence, coupled with his understanding of humanity, may be why his alter ego, John Jones, the detective, is such a great detective. And, it's this reason also that I really respect this character. Even when he's in his everyday guise, his everyday life, he is solving crimes. He is helping people. Don't get me wrong, Clark Kent, he's a great writer, and he's helping people by telling, the stories of people and getting news out. But John, when he's not wearing the cape, he's wearing a trench coat, and he is out there solving crimes and helping people. The guy doesn't stop. It's what really makes him one of my favorite characters. So this power set is really on par with no one else in the DCU. His standard powers make him, formidable. The strength, the speed, the regeneration, the flight. But then add to it the phasing, the invisibility, the intellect, and being the most powerful telepath on the planet. That makes him arguably the most powerful being in the DCU. But unfortunately, none of this has helped John when he is given his own title. As I said, John had a number of his own titles, each getting canceled or sidelined for various DC events. In DC's latest relaunch and reset, Rebirth, John is unfortunately absent. Yes, other characters have been brought back throughout this year, and they plan on bringing more and more back, but they have not brought John back. Now, I've read here and there that they're planning to, but when this is, who knows? If you've heard anything, go ahead over to this episode's page, this post, and post it, because I'd love to know if, John is coming back and when. Because he, like I said, really is one of my all-time favorites. And that's also why I was so excited to have the opportunity to talk with J.M. DeMatteis, the prolific novelist and comic book writer that redefined John in the 80s and made him the character who he is today. J.M. DeMatteis is an Eisner Award-winning comic book writer who has written some of the most known and loved comic book stories that include Kraven's Last Hunt, Blood, A Tale, Moonshadow, his autobiographical Brooklyn Dreams, JLA, and of course, Martian Manhunter. Not only has he written for some of our favorite comics, but he has also written many episodes of the animated TV series Justice League Adventures and Batman Brave and the Bold. So without further delay, let's listen to my interview with J.M. DeMatteis. Hi, I wanted to welcome you to the show, J.M. DeMatteis. Now, we just used J.M., correct?
Yep.
All right. And the topic on the podcast that I went over earlier in the show was I was looking at the history and background of pretty much one of my favorite characters in the DCU, John Jones, the Martian Manhunter. And when I think of that character, I think of your amazing miniseries that you did in '88 with Mark Badger.
Yeah. I share your love of that character, although it's interesting. He wasn't a character that I particularly cared about one way or the other before I wrote him. And I was just talking to somebody about this recently. There's this thing that happens. You have your favorite characters as a reader, and then you get to write them, and you discover where that relationship is as a writer with that character. It may even be a favorite character, but you don't click writing them. Then there are these characters that they're like, all right, Martian Manhunter, I remember the Martian Manhunter, blah, 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 I don't really care. And then you start to write the character, and you fall in love. And that's what happened with John Jones. I really just completely connected with the character. I think the first time I really wrote him was I did the end of the previous Justice League, the one that was previous to the one that Keith and I did.
That's right, with Gypsy and Vibe and him.
Right. So I did 6 issues, including this 4-part end of the Justice League story he was very central to. And just something clicked right from the start, and then once we started, doing our Justice League, the connection with the character just deepened. So it was a treat and a delight to do that miniseries.
Yeah. What I think the thing that I really that really draws me to it is, of course, you've got the original origin of John, that is, this typical Golden Age, Silver Age, campy mad scientist. He presses a button and zap, here he is on our planet. And a lot of people don't realize he actually, through, the different House of Mystery and stuff like that, he's actually still in contact with Mars in his original origin.
Oh, I didn't remember that. No.
Yeah, I didn't either. That's what I love about doing the show, is learning these things. And I think what I loved most about your story, your miniseries with John, is that you were able to not radically change the character's origins, but really give it more of a, not this one-dimensional feel.
Yeah, well, that's always the goal, whoever the character is. You want to be able to kind of drill into their heads and bore down as deeply as you can, and that's what I tried to do there. It's like, okay, well, the first obvious thing to me was like, he came from Mars. We now live in a world where we know there's no life on Mars.
Exactly.
So we have to adjust that one. And I'm always fascinated with the psychology of the characters, which is why I don't think they kept it. You would maybe know better than I would, but why I came up with the idea that the fire was a psychological weakness and not actually a physical weakness. Because as we know in the beginning with DC, Superman had kryptonite, so everybody had to have something akin to kryptonite.
Right.
And whether it was Green Lantern's ring, what was it, yellow?
Yellow. Yeah.
Well, everybody had their crazy thing that their powers wouldn't work with, and I just thought it's a lot more interesting if there's a psychological root to this. Also then building the backstory and the mythology, giving him a family, the fact that the fire came from the fact that there had been a plague on Mars and they had to burn the bodies, and he had to burn the bodies of his wife and daughter, which completely traumatized him. All these things combined, I think, to sort of deepen and expand that character. At least I hope it did.
Yeah, because like you were mentioning, in your story, in the original story, like I just mentioned, he's zapped here, he's still in contact with Mars, and then he goes and solves crimes and whatnot, becomes a superhero. And you did delve more deeply into the character, and you made it so that he was actually transported over thousands of years.
Yeah.
And he's even more now out of place. Now, what I wonder is, we always think sometimes like Superman and John Jones, they're very similar in that they're from another planet, they're alone. They're both very powerful. I almost think John is more powerful than Superman, but I know better to get in those kind of fights.
And I don't really like those discussions either. That said, I think he may be the single most powerful character among all those heroes.
Yeah, and so what I thought was interesting was that here he is now. He's pulled across time, and he's lost his family, and to me, as a parent, the loss of a child. Was that, what gave you the idea to sort of really give him this really tragic backstory?
It's just that you're always hunting for something emotional and psychological that, as I said before, will deepen the characters. There's just so far sometimes we can go in changing these characters, but there's no limit in some ways to how deep we can go, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You're not going to change the basics of, say, who Superman is, but there's always something new if you root around as a writer to find inside his psyche. And that's the same thing. And what's more of an emotional hook than family? And, I look back now, and I honest to God haven't thought of it till this exact moment. But, when I was writing that series, I had just gone through a divorce. Mm. And so I wonder if that, I'm actually thinking now, well, I wonder if that played into the whole family thing there, and the loss and the longing, and the pain of that. I don't know if it's true, but these things these things creep in. I always say that all stories are autobiographical, whether we realize it or not. That I could look at the most innocuous throwaway little story and realize I'm revealing the depths of my soul without even knowing it, Right, so that might have played into that that aspect. But clearly, family is a big root for all of us, and it's something that we can all relate to.
Yeah, and again, the whole idea of he's even more alone now. He is the psychological. Fire being more of a psychological thing, and him working to overcome that, I thought was really interesting, because it never really made like any kind of old Silver Age sort of device, it never really made sense. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. No. Well, it made sense for that era in that time. There's a certain charm to those old stories. It's like I especially have a soft spot for those Superman stories of the late 50s and early 60s that were very, very fanciful. And they really were, many of them, great children's stories,
Yeah.
And we can look at them and laugh now because we think we're, quote, more sophisticated. But there's a real charm to them. And also you look at some of those old stories, and in 8 pages, they had more story packed in there, sometimes in 3 panels than we have sometimes in 6 issues these days,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I have a lot of respect for what they did back then, but it's a different world and a different time.
Well, and again, I hadn't read it in quite some time, and I dug it out of my collection and read through the miniseries again, and I really was amazed at, I think a lot of books at that time, they weren't sort of pushing the character and working, on their, psychological issues. And, I'm also thinking, jumping from Martian Manhunter a little bit, I think the first thing of yours I ever read was Blood, A Tale.
Oh, okay. So you came from that direction, not from the superhero direction. Okay.
Yeah, and I just remember, and I believe that came out in 86.
It came out in 87 because Blood started. Moonshadow came out right after Moonshadow finished, and Moonshadow finished in 87. Then Blood started. Yeah.
Okay, and but I remember reading it, and I was, I'll admit it, I was in high school, and I was getting pieces of it, and it was one of those things where you read it and you start to see. And I was painting at the time and writing at the time. And it was one of the first things that, comics-wise, that made me say, wait a second, it's beautiful. I mean, the painting and the lettering.
Yeah. Kent Williams' art is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I think Gaspar did the lettering, yeah.
Yeah, and, that old hand lettering that, you don't see anymore. And I just remember thinking, wow, this is what a comic book could be.
That in a lot of ways is what that was for me too. Working on both Moonshadow and Blood in that period was for me a way to strike out and step out of those superhero universes and see who I was as a writer and what kind of stories can we tell without those structures around us. And it was incredibly liberating for me. And it's funny because Blood is one of those series that I've noticed over the years, people either just like kind of scratch their head and walk away, or it seems to penetrate to the depths of their souls, Mm-hmm. And I understand both reactions. It was an attempt, what I said at the time was an attempt to consciously write from the unconscious, to just sort of open that door to what was back there. And Kent Williams and I both, because he was living literally next door to me at the time, we were working very closely, and just seeing what we can kind of dig out, throw it out, and then figure out later what it all meant, Not that there wasn't structure and story and themes that I had in mind, but there were a lot of other things in there. It was almost like a Rorschach test. So I could look at it now and go, oh, that's what it meant. And you could look at it and go, oh, that's what it meant. And even if we totally disagree, I feel like your opinion is as valid as mine. Blood especially was very experimental for me, and I grew a lot as a writer, as I did with Moonshadow, but in a different way. I grew a lot as a writer by working on that series.
I know you touched on it a little bit as far as being not having the constraints with doing Blood and Moonshadow that you would probably have, obviously, doing a straight superhero book like Justice League or Spider-Man. How much, though, are you able to, as a writer, sort of like when you were doing Martian Manhunter, where you approached and said, someone said to you from DC, hey, we want to sort of work on John and bring him out more, My
memory is, well, let me say 2 things. First,
sure.
There was a period there, in the 80s and into the early 90s, but more so than even now. I mean, now there's still a lot of freedom when you work with these characters, but then there was a lot more freedom to impose is the wrong word, inject your individual voice into these characters. I think about my run on Dr. Fate, which really was like a creator-owned book. I took Dr. Fate, turned it into what I wanted it to be, and did this 2-year story that was completely personal, and so there was a lot of freedom, a lot. Even when I worked on Spider-Man, especially my 2 years on Spectacular Spider-Man, those stories were very personal and very unique, and I was given a lot of freedom to tell them the way I wanted to tell them. I don't know if you can do that now because everything is just a little more corporate. I'm not saying that there's not freedom, but I think there was even more freedom back then to just remake things and make it your own. And so Martian Manhunter, my memory is, we were writing the character in Justice League every month. I fell in love with the character, and I suspect I just went, because I remember they didn't come to me. I suspect I just went to Andy Helfer, who was our editor, one of the best editors who ever worked in the business, and just said, hey, I'd love to do this. And it was also very easy in those days to get things approved. Oh, you want to do this? Okay, give me a couple minutes. Things got approved, and off you went,
Right.
So that's really all it took, was just a request on my part. And then I'd worked with Mark Badger on this wonderful Gargoyle miniseries we'd done at Marvel, and he did my Greenberg the Vampire graphic novel. So we really enjoyed working together, and he's a very creative guy and a wonderful storyteller and a very experimental artist, and we had a great time working on it.
And yeah, that's definitely, the series definitely is one of those ones where the art, the colors, and the lettering really all really work to serve the story and get the idea across.
I think it was Bob Lappin, did the lettering on that. And he was the one that lettered all our Justice League books, which, God bless him with all the dialogue I put in those books. Always able to make it look artistic and really flow. It was a great team, and it all came together. And of course, we had Andy holding the whole thing together, which was great.
And who came up? Did you sort of do the description? Because of course, one of the really interesting things about the revamp or the giving him more depth as a character was that the shape that he has, that we see him as sort of, as they describe it, the beetle-browed, Martian, was something that he took upon himself because he was so traumatized from the death of his family that he sort of imprinted on the doctor, Erdel, that brought him over. And who sort of came up with this new look for John?
Well, the idea, as I remember, was that, I was looking back at these old stories, and here's this character that looked like a 1950s conception of what a man from Mars would be, And I thought, well, maybe that's all it is somebody's conception of what a man from Mars would be in that era. And what if his true form was something very, very different? So the idea was mine. The design, as I recall, was all Badger's. We discussed the idea, and he went off and came up with what we jokingly used to call the Gumby shape,
Right, because he's green. He's got that sort of flowing arms and whatnot.
Right, and a kind of point on his head a little bit. And, but it was a great design. It was a great design, and it's become a permanent part of the character as far as I know. I mean, everything gets changed so often, you never know what's still part of any character.
Right.
But that seemed to have taken.
Yeah. And it's very frustrating with John because I collected pretty much every series he's been in, but for some reason, like any books these days, they get to a certain point and then they end the series. And he's one of those that they do in fits and starts. Yeah. And it just hasn't clicked for some reason.
Yeah, and he's one of those characters where some characters you write them and you feel complete and you feel done. And other ones, like if I got a call tomorrow and said, hey, you want to do a Martian Manhunter ongoing series, I would do it in a heartbeat because I love that character. Oh, so much potential. And I have to say, the little nerd in me, the 12-year-old in me, gets such a kick out of seeing him on Supergirl every week. You know what I mean?
I was going to ask you about that.
When the episode where they first revealed him, the 12-year-old in my soul did backflips. It was like, oh my God, it's John. It was just great.
And I got to tell you, that is one of, obviously Supergirl, that's a fairly, I wouldn't say easy because they've made mistakes with that kind of thing with suits and whatnot. But the representation of John on Supergirl, that is one of the most incredible comic book likenesses, like characters I've ever seen.
Yeah, they do a great job. And he's such a fantastic actor. I've seen, he's British. I don't know if you know that. And I've seen him in a lot of BBC things. Yeah. And he's really a superb actor.
And I believe he was in Homeland for a few seasons too.
Oh, was he? Oh, okay. Yeah. And he's just so this it's a wonderful conception of the character and a wonderful actor. And as you said, the designs, the effects, they really handle him very well. If there was a Martian Manhunter show on every week, I'd be there watching it for sure.
Oh, heck yeah. Let's see. Well, this has been, I've been reading your stuff since I can remember. And I actually got a chance to talk to you at the Albany Comic-Con last year.
Okay.
And one of the other things I wanted to talk about really quick with you is your workshops, your writing workshops that you do.
Right. Yeah, the writing workshops that I really try to do regularly, and if I'm lucky, I do once a year. And I would actually, I should, now that we're talking about it, I should start thinking about doing another one in the late spring. A few years ago, I did an evening at MoCA in the city, the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art, whatever. I always get confused what the initials are. And in the course of doing a whole evening, I was being interviewed by my old friend Danny Fingeroth, and talking about craft and art, and realized, when you've done this as long as I have, there's a lot that you know. There's a lot that you don't even know until someone asks you about it. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to kind of take this and take all this stuff that I've learned doing this over the years and create a workshop? And I've never done one before, and it was so much fun to put it together. And what I've found invariably is I get the nicest people that show up. We try to keep it small. I really don't want at most more than 8 or 10 people, and sometimes like 6 or 7 people or whatever. We keep it small. It's an entire weekend. It starts on a Friday night and goes through to Sunday. That's for the level 1, and I've done a few level 2 workshops, which are more writing intensive and go for 4 days. But it's just been such a great experience for me, and it's the old cliche about teaching, but I end up learning just as much as I'm imparting,
Yeah.
And we talk about the nuts and bolts of professional writing, the craft of it, the business end of it, but we also talk about the part that I love the most, which is sort of the metaphysical aspect of creativity, and where does it come from, and working with the unconscious, and all those wonderful things that I could sit and probably talk about for a month straight. So, it's a great little workshop, and I do it in upstate New York and usually in Kingston, which some people go, well, I don't live there, and I've had people come from Mexico to take my workshop. So it's like when people are really motivated, they'll come no matter where it is.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, they're a lot of fun, and just talking about it makes me want to set another one up for the spring. So thanks for bringing it up.
Hey,
and if anyone's curious about it, you can go to my website, which is jmdmateis.com, and there's a workshop section. And when the next workshop is scheduled, I'll put it up there. And I also will put it up on Twitter and Facebook as well.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I tell you, I want to thank you, James, so much for taking the time to talk to us about John and your workshops and all your other just amazing work in comics.
Well, thank you.
This has been a blast. The show itself will go live on Monday.
Okay.
So you can look for that. And again, everybody, if you're interested in checking out JM's site, he gave you the website, jmdmateis.com, where you can. I was on it today, just going through everything, and it's making me want to buy some of the novels you've been writing.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I have to say, social media. I was late coming to social media. I have to say, I kind of dragged my feet, and I have had such wonderful experiences. It's such a wonderful way to connect with the people that read and appreciate my work. And you hear all these stories about just negative experiences, and I have to say that 95, if not 98% of my experiences have been hugely positive. It's a great way to connect with people, to connect with the fans, and I really enjoy it. So, if you're on Twitter and you want to get in touch with me, or Facebook, or you want to put a comment on my website, I'm always happy to respond. In fact, I try to respond to everybody as much as I possibly can. So it's been really fun for me, because we do this. We're sitting in a room by ourselves all day, right, playing with these imaginary creatures that pop out of our heads. So it's nice to connect with the actual living beings, even if they're in cyber form, right, but these actual living beings that are reading and appreciating the work. It's a really, I find it very, very valuable and often very touching.
True. Just to know that someone's out there, they're looking at your stuff, and it's making such an impact.
Yeah, it is really nice to know that because I write for myself, And then the second person that I write for is sort of this reader who I imagine is reading the way that I read stuff that I love and I care about. The stuff that I respond to is the stuff that touches my heart and moves me and makes me think, but mostly that touches my heart. And so when my stories ripple out there and I find people that it's having that effect on, that the story in some way really impacted them and changed their life, even if it's in the smallest way, or inspired them in some way, it really means the world to me. It really means the world to me, because that's one of the I do it to stay sane, because if I didn't write, I'd go nuts. And I do it to shoot those story arrows out there and hopefully touch a few hearts along the way. Yeah.
Well, I can tell you, your work over the years has done that for me in my writing and in my painting and my coloring. And again, I want to thank you for doing the interview. And hopefully I'll see you at the Albany Comic-Con again.
Yeah, that would be great. And I look forward to it. And thank you, Kevin. I really enjoyed this.
No problem. Thanks, J.M. I really appreciate it.
Okay, take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, wow, I hope you enjoyed that interview. I've been reading his stuff for so long. Having a conversation with him about one of my favorite characters, it was awesome. Well, I want to thank you for listening to the show this week. Remember to head over to the site and check out the episodes page and the post for this particular show to see all the different pages and art and some of the links to all these stories that I've been talking about. There's a lot of awesome pictures and pages over there for you to take a look at. There you can listen to the show, or better yet, head over to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. I'd love to see some more reviews. We've got 3 reviews and I want to see some more. So if you get a second, please hop over there and leave a review. It would really help the show out. And the more reviews we have, the more we sort of move up the iTunes sort of ranking ladder, and more people will get to learn about the show. So if you get a second, head over and leave a review. And if you have any ideas about the character, again, head over to the website, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com, and then right there on the homepage, there's a little section, a little microphone, where you can actually leave me a voice message on who you'd like to hear about and why. So go ahead and do that, and that'd be great. I mean, I'm getting some stuff on Facebook, I'm getting some emails, but I love one of these audio messages so that I can actually use it on the show. So again, if you get a second, head over to heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com and leave me a message about who you'd like to hear about on the show. Well, that's it for this episode. I want to thank everyone for listening. We'll be back next week with more. Take care.